Hello, and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying tales to share, and one of them comes from the shadowed outskirts of Bangkok. This story takes place at a hospital most people would recognize by name, but few would dare to linger in after dark. Phranangklao Hospital. By day, it is a place of recovery and care, its hallways echoing with the sounds of rushing nurses and anxious families. But when the fluorescent lights dim and the corridors grow silent, the building transforms into something else entirely. Locals whisper about its old wings that no longer see patients, about staircases that lead to places that feel wrong, and about waiting rooms where no one wants to be left alone. They say, shadows don't behave as they should there. They move where no person stands, sliding ahead of nurses during night rounds, ducking into rooms that are supposed to be empty. Patients whisper that they wake to pale figures standing by their beds, silent and unblinking, fading into the walls as though the hospital itself swallows them whole. And yet, the most chilling story isn't found in the wards or the stairwells. It's in the waiting area, a place where silence is never truly empty, and where a single wrong answer to the wrong question might change you forever. On the outskirts of Bangkok, where the city's neon lights fade into quieter streets, stands Phranangklao Hospital. To anyone driving by during the day, it looks like any other medical building. Concrete walls lined with windows, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights spilling out at night, and a stream of patients arriving at all hours. But for those who know its history, Phranangklao is not just another hospital. It is a place layered with stories, where life and death walk side by side, and where silence can feel heavier than the machines humming in the wards. The story begins with a young man named Arun. He was not sick, nor was he visiting for treatment. Instead, he found himself in the waiting area of the hospital late one night, after accompanying his aunt who had been admitted for observation. Doctors assured the family there was no cause for alarm, but procedures would take hours. Rather than drive home and return in the morning, Arun chose to stay behind. It was supposed to be a simple choice: sit, wait, and keep his aunt company until she was settled. The waiting area was quiet, almost too quiet. Rows of plastic chairs stretched across the tiled floor, their faded blue surfaces reflecting the cold light overhead. A television mounted in the corner played softly, but the channel flickered with static as though the signal was fighting to hold. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, sharp and clean, but beneath it lingered something else, a dampness, like rain-soaked concrete, even though it hadn't rained that day. At first, Arun didn't notice how empty the room was. The receptionist had stepped away, and no other families lingered at that hour. He was alone, except for the quiet hum of machines deeper in the hospital. He tried to distract himself by scrolling through his phone, but the Wi-Fi cut in and out, leaving him staring at a loading screen more often than not. As the minutes stretched into hours, his mind wandered. He remembered stories his grandmother used to tell about hospitals, about spirits drawn to the places where life ended. He had always dismissed them as superstition, tales meant to scare children into respect for the dead. Yet here, sitting in the glow of buzzing lights and echoing halls, those stories returned with uncomfortable clarity. The building itself seemed to encourage the thoughts. Every sound carried. The squeak of his shoes when he shifted, the faint crack of the plastic chair as he leaned back, the distant echo of a cart rolling somewhere far down the hall. It felt as though the hospital was alive, listening, waiting. The old wings of Phranangklao were never far from mind either. Arun had passed them earlier, their doors chained and locked, their windows covered with dust. Locals whispered those wings were shut down not for repairs, but because too many strange things had happened there. Nurses who swore they were followed on their night rounds. Patients who claimed to see figures standing at the foot of their beds. A pediatric wing where laughter was still heard, even though it had been abandoned for years. Arun told himself not to think about it. He shifted in his chair, tried to relax, and told himself it was just another night. Yet, as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the air in the waiting room seemed to thicken. The fluorescent lights hummed louder, flickering at the edges. The silence pressed in harder, as though the entire building was holding its breath. And in that moment, as Arun sat alone in the waiting room, he began to wonder if his choice to stay behind had been a mistake. Because in Phranangklao Hospital, waiting alone was never just waiting. It was an invitation, an opening, a chance for something unseen to draw closer. And he was about to find out what that really meant. Arun sat slouched in the plastic chair, the kind that dug into the back after too long. He checked his phone again, but the signal was still weak. The loading icon spun endlessly, offering him no distraction. With a sigh, he slipped it back into his pocket and rubbed his eyes. The air was unnervingly still, as if the entire hospital had gone dormant for the night. Even the faint television in the corner had gone to static, the screen casting a dull glow across the empty waiting room. That was when he noticed it. The sound. At first it was faint. So faint that Arun thought it was just his imagination. A soft, rhythmic tapping, echoing, down the corridor that led deeper into the hospital. He froze, tilting his head, straining to listen. The taps were steady, evenly spaced, like footsteps on tile. Click, click, click. Arun glanced toward the reception desk, expecting to see the receptionist returning, but the desk remained empty. The hallway stretched beyond it, lit in that same harsh fluorescent glow, but no figure appeared. The sound continued for a moment, then stopped abruptly, as though whoever had been walking had halted just out of sight. He told himself it was nothing. A nurse making late-night rounds, maybe a guard. This was a hospital, after all. People moved through it at all hours. Yet something about the sound gnawed at him. It hadn't echoed like normal footsteps. It had carried strangely, as though the hallway itself were amplifying it. Shaking it off, Arun leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, trying to settle. Minutes passed. He almost managed to convince himself he'd imagined it when the sound came again. But this time, it wasn't footsteps. It was laughter, soft, high-pitched, unmistakably the laughter of a child. It floated from the far end of the corridor, light and fleeting, like a giggle quickly stifled. Arun sat bolt upright, his heart hammering in his chest. The pediatric wing. He remembered what the locals said, that children's voices could still be heard at night, even though that part of the hospital had been shut down for years. Arun forced himself to breathe, his eyes darting to the empty hallway. Nothing. Just the hum of the lights and the sterile glow of the walls. He considered getting up, walking to the desk, maybe even asking if someone else had heard it, but something inside him resisted. A quiet, primal instinct that told him to stay put, to keep still, to act like he had heard nothing at all. The laughter faded, but the silence that replaced it was heavier than before. Arun rubbed his hands over his knees, trying to dispel the chill creeping into his bones. He glanced at the clock above the reception desk. Midnight had passed. He told himself he just needed to endure a little longer. His aunt would be settled soon, and he could leave. But the hospital seemed to have other plans. The flickering of the lights began next. A faint buzz filled the waiting room as the fluorescent bulbs above him dimmed, then flared again, casting shadows that stretched unnaturally long across the floor. Arun stared upward, watching as the glow sputtered and steadied, then faltered again, like a breath struggling to catch. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shadow sliding across the far wall, smooth and fluid, as though someone had walked past. Arun's head whipped toward it, but there was nothing there. Just the empty chairs, the desk, and the long stretch of hallway. The shadow, however, had been undeniable, too distinct, too deliberate. Someone or something had passed through the room. His chest tightened, his pulse pounding in his ears. Arun tried to rationalize it, a trick of the lights, a reflection, his tired mind playing with him. But the more he thought, the more the explanation unraveled. There was no one else here. He was alone. The waiting room felt colder now, the chill seeping in through his clothes, sinking deep into his skin. He rubbed his arms, exhaling sharply, and tried to steady himself. Maybe he should get up, walk to the nurse's station, find someone, anyone, just to break the isolation. Before he could stand, a new sound filled the air, a soft rustling, like fabric brushing against fabric. The faint shuffle of shoes on tile. It came from the hallway again, closer this time. Arun sat frozen, every instinct screaming at him not to move, not to draw attention. The sound grew clearer, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic creak, as if a cart's wheels were rolling over the tiled floor. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Too absolute. Arun's throat tightened. He could almost feel a presence, just out of sight, waiting. Minutes dragged by. Nothing appeared. No nurse, no receptionist, only the oppressive quiet of the waiting room. Arun swallowed hard and leaned back, his chair creaking softly. His body was tense, but his mind clung desperately to reason. He was imagining things. He had to be, but deep down, he knew better. The footsteps, the laughter, the shadow, none of it was coincidence. Something was here with him, something that didn't belong. And as he sat in the cold, flickering glow of the waiting room, Arun began to wonder if the hospital was testing him, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. Because at Phranangklao Hospital, the first sign of strangeness was never the last. It was just the beginning. Arun's eyes kept darting to the hallway, even though it remained empty. The silence pressed harder with every passing minute, and the sterile smell of antiseptic seemed sharper, almost suffocating. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his nerves buzzing, when the faintest sound broke the stillness again. It was a voice, low at first, almost like a whisper carried by the hum of the lights. Arun leaned forward, straining to hear. The voice was soft, steady, and it seemed to be repeating something. At first it was too faint to make out, but then a phrase cut through, chilling him to the core. "Are you waiting for someone?" Arun's breath caught in his throat. The words were flat, cold, almost mechanical. He whipped his head toward the hallway, but there was no one there, just empty space and buzzing lights. His chest tightened, every instinct telling him to get up and leave, but his body refused to move. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. For a few moments, all was still again. Arun tried to convince himself he'd imagined it, that his mind had conjured a voice out of fear and silence. But before he could steady himself, a new disturbance pulled him deeper into unease. The receptionist returned. Arun hadn't even noticed her approach until she was behind the desk again, shuffling papers, moving slowly, deliberately. Relieved to see another person, he sat up straighter, ready to speak. But something about her immediately struck him as wrong. She never looked at him, not once. Her eyes stayed fixed on the papers she shuffled, though there were only 2 or 3 sheets. Her movements were repetitive, as if she were going through the motions of a task that didn't matter. Her expression was blank, drained of the normal warmth or efficiency one might expect from someone working the night shift. Arun cleared his throat softly, but she didn't react. He shifted in his seat, trying to catch her eye, but she seemed locked in her own world. After a long, uneasy silence, he decided to speak. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice cracking. She froze mid-motion. Her hands hovered over the papers, stiff, unmoving. Slowly, her head tilted upward, but not toward him. Her gaze fixed somewhere above and to the side, as though she were listening to something only she could hear. Arun's skin prickled, every hair on his body standing on end. Then, in the same flat, cold tone he had heard moments ago, she said, "Are you waiting for someone?" The words echoed through the empty waiting room like a blade sliding across glass. Arun's blood ran cold. It was the exact same voice he had heard in the hallway, the exact same cadence. He couldn't answer. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The receptionist's head tilted back down, and she resumed her shuffling motions as if nothing had happened. Arun pressed his palms against his knees, trying to ground himself, his mind racing. He wanted to ask again, to demand if she was playing some cruel joke, but something deep inside warned him not to. To answer that question, whatever it meant, felt dangerous. Instead, he leaned back in silence, his pulse thundering in his ears. The minutes that followed stretched unbearably long. He tried to keep his focus on anything else, the static on the television, the ticking of the clock, but every time his eyes drifted back to the receptionist, her movements seemed less and less human. She shuffled the same papers, over and over, as if stuck in a loop, and then, without warning, the lights above flickered violently, plunging the room into stuttering flashes of shadow and light. Arun flinched, his gaze darting toward the hallway again. This time he saw her, a figure in the distance, just barely visible at the end of the corridor. Dressed in a nurse's uniform, her cap tilted too low to reveal her face. She stood motionless, her posture stiff, as though waiting. Arun's throat went dry. He blinked, and in the next flicker of light, she was gone. The hallway stood empty once more. He turned back toward the receptionist, but the desk was empty too. The chair sat pushed back neatly, the papers stacked in a perfect pile. She had vanished as silently as she had appeared. Arun's breath grew shallow. His chest ached with each inhale, every nerve screaming at him to leave. But his legs felt heavy, like they were rooted to the cold tile floor. The clock ticked past 1 in the morning, and as the waiting room settled into silence once again, Arun realized something undeniable. He was no longer waiting alone. Something else was waiting with him, something that already knew the answer to its question, even though he hadn't spoken a word. The waiting room had become unbearable. The air felt heavier with every passing second, pressing down on Arun's chest until each breath came shallow and sharp. He rubbed his palms against his knees, trying to keep himself grounded, but his body wouldn't stop trembling. He wanted to leave, to run into the night and never come back. Yet something about the hospital's silence held him there like a chain. The fluorescent lights buzzed above him, flickering faintly again. His eyes drifted toward the hallway, and that was when he heard it. The footsteps. Clear this time. Steady. Coming closer. Click. 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 Arun sat frozen in his chair, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. The sound grew louder, echoing against the sterile walls, until it seemed to seep directly into his bones. He could feel it vibrating through the floor, rattling in his ribs. Click, click. The sound stopped just outside the waiting room. Arun's eyes darted to the corridor. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, slowly, she appeared. The nurse. She stepped into view with a deliberate slowness, her uniform pressed and spotless, her cap tilted low enough that her face was hidden. She didn't walk like the living. Her movements were too fluid, her posture too rigid, as if every step had been rehearsed long before. Arun's throat closed. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. She stopped in the center of the hallway, just far enough away that he couldn't see her face, yet close enough that he could feel her presence filling the entire waiting room. Her head tilted slightly, and then the voice came, flat, cold. "Are you waiting for someone?" The words stabbed through him like ice. His body screamed to respond, to say something, anything that would make her go away. But he remembered the stories, the warnings whispered by locals. If you answered yes, she would vanish. But if you answered no, you would never leave the waiting room the same. Arun's lips trembled. He couldn't force the words out. Instead, he sat in paralyzed silence, praying she would disappear. But she didn't. She began to walk toward him. Click, click. Each step echoed through the room, deliberate and unhurried, until she was standing at the threshold of the waiting area. Arun gripped the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The air had grown so cold he could see his own breath clouding in front of him. The nurse tilted her head again, and this time, the brim of her cap shifted just enough for him to glimpse her face. Arun wished he hadn't. Her skin was as pale as paper, stretched tight over hollow cheeks. Her eyes were nothing but black voids, bottomless and unblinking. And her mouth was twisted into something that was not a smile, not a frown, but a shape that suggested she had practiced human expressions and failed. Again, she asked, "Are you waiting for someone?" The words didn't just echo in the room, they seemed to rattle inside his skull, bouncing against his thoughts until he couldn't tell if he was hearing them with his ears or with his mind. Arun's chest heaved. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He couldn't even force out a sound. His silence stretched, and with it, the nurse seemed to lean closer, her face still hidden in shadow, but her presence pressing against him like a weight. And then, all at once, the waiting room changed. The lights above flickered violently, plunging the space into bursts of light and shadow. Arun blinked rapidly, and in each flash he saw something new. The chairs around him were no longer empty. Figures sat slumped in them, pale and silent, their hollow eyes fixed forward. Some wore hospital gowns stained with old, dark patches. Others looked like ordinary families, their faces drained of life, their bodies rigid as though frozen in the act of waiting. The room was full, yet silent. Every figure seemed to breathe in unison, a low hiss that filled the space like leaking air. Arun's stomach turned. He pressed back against his chair, horrified, his eyes darting from one figure to the next. None of them moved, yet all of them were undeniably there. The nurse stepped closer. The smell of rot seeped into the air, sharp and suffocating, as though the walls themselves were decaying. Arun gagged, covering his mouth with a trembling hand. For the third time, the nurse spoke. "Are you waiting for someone?" The words came louder now, almost demanding, and the figures in the chairs shifted ever so slightly, their heads tilting toward him as if awaiting his answer. Arun's mind fractured under the pressure. He wanted to scream yes, to say anything that might make her disappear, but his voice failed him. He sat trapped in silence, surrounded by shadows that had taken shape, by the dead who had returned to wait beside him. And in that moment, Arun understood the truth. This was no ordinary waiting room. It was a threshold, a place where the living and the dead sat side by side, bound together by a question that had no safe answer. The nurse leaned closer still, and Arun realized that whether he spoke or not, he had already been chosen. The hospital was not just watching him anymore. It was claiming him. Arun sat frozen in the plastic chair, his breath shallow and ragged. The nurse stood before him, her face hidden beneath the shadow of her cap, her question lingering in the air like a blade suspended above his throat. The waiting room was no longer empty. Silent figures filled the chairs around him, their pale forms turned ever so slightly in his direction, their hollow eyes waiting for his response. He wanted to run, but his body would not obey. The smell of rot clung to the air, thick enough to burn the back of his throat. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying that when he opened them, the nightmare would be gone. But when he did, the scene had only shifted. The nurse was gone. The pale figures remained, though, and now they sat more rigidly, as though frozen in place. Their faces were expressionless, but something about the tilt of their heads suggested patience, like people resigned to an endless wait. Arun's skin prickled as he realized they weren't moving at all. Not breathing, not blinking. They were statues carved out of shadow and bone, and yet he could feel their presence as vividly as the pounding of his own heart. Then, from somewhere beyond the waiting room, a sound rose, a wheel squeaking against tile, the familiar creak of a hospital cart being pushed slowly down the hall. Arun turned his head just as it passed the doorway. A metal gurney rolled silently across the corridor, and for a brief moment he saw what was on it. A white sheet drawn up to cover the outline of a body, the shape of feet pressed faintly against the end. Arun's stomach twisted. The gurney rolled past, but there was no one pushing it. The squeak of its wheels faded into silence, leaving only the faint hum of the lights. And then, at last, someone else appeared. A nurse, but not the faceless one. This woman was older, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined with exhaustion. She moved quickly, almost frantically, clutching a bundle of incense sticks in one trembling hand. She didn't notice Arun at first. She hurried into the waiting room, her eyes darting to the pale figures in the chairs. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and without hesitation she lit the incense and began circling the room. Thick smoke curled into the air, its scent sharp and bitter. She whispered prayers under her breath, words Arun couldn't understand, her tone urgent, desperate. As the smoke spread, the pale figures in the chairs began to dissolve, their outlines blurring like mist in sunlight. One by one they faded, until the chairs sat empty once more. Arun's chest heaved as if he'd been released from a crushing weight. The nurse finally noticed him. Her eyes widened in alarm, and she rushed toward him, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. "What are you doing here?" she hissed. Arun's mouth opened, but no words came. His throat was too dry, his mind too scattered. "You shouldn't have stayed alone," she said sharply, her voice low but trembling. "Not here, not after midnight." Her words struck him like cold water. They echoed the whispers he had heard before, the warnings about never waiting alone in this hospital. What were they? Arun finally managed, his voice barely audible. The nurse's eyes flicked toward the chairs, though they were empty now. She pressed the incense closer to him, as if shielding him with the smoke. "They are the ones who never left," she said softly. "Patients, families, people who waited too long." Her words sank into him like ice. He thought of the footsteps, the laughter in the pediatric wing, the gurney rolling past with no one to push it. All the stories he had heard, all the warnings he had brushed aside, suddenly fit together into a chilling truth. The hospital was not haunted by one spirit. It was full of them. "They ask the question," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Are you waiting for someone? It seems harmless, but it isn't. It is their invitation, their test. If you answer yes, they let you go, but if you say no—" She trailed off, her eyes narrowing, as though the rest of the explanation was too dangerous to speak aloud. Arun swallowed hard, his pulse racing. "And if you don't answer at all?" The nurse's grip on his arm tightened. "Then they decide for you." The room seemed to close in around him at those words. He thought of the silence he had kept, the way the faceless nurse had leaned closer, waiting. Had he already been chosen? The nurse must have seen the terror in his eyes, because she shook her head firmly. "You're lucky I came when I did. But you must leave. Now, do not stay another minute." Arun nodded quickly, his body trembling with the urgency in her voice. She pressed the incense into his hand, the smoke curling around his fingers. "Keep this with you until you are outside the gates. Don't look back, no matter what you hear. And remember, never wait alone here again." Her words reframed everything. The footsteps, the laughter, the shadows. They weren't isolated incidents. They were pieces of a larger pattern, signs of a threshold where the living and the dead intertwined. The waiting room was not just a place for the sick and their families. It was a crossroads. And as Arun stumbled to his feet, clutching the burning incense, he realized the most horrifying truth of all. The spirits hadn't just been waiting for anyone. They had been waiting for him. Arun's legs felt like they belonged to someone else as he stumbled toward the exit, the smoke from the incense trailing behind him in curling ribbons. Every step echoed too loudly against the tiles, like the building itself was keeping track of his escape. His chest burned, not from running, but from the weight of the silence pressing against his back. The automatic doors slid open slowly, agonizingly slow, as though reluctant to let him leave. Beyond them was the night air, humid and alive, with the distant hum of traffic. Freedom waited just a few steps away. He clutched the incense tighter, its glow his only lifeline, and forced himself forward. But just before he crossed the threshold, a sound made him freeze. Click, click. Footsteps, faint but deliberate, echoed from behind. His throat clenched. Against every warning screaming in his mind, Arun turned his head ever so slightly. The waiting room was empty. The rows of chairs sat in sterile silence. The reception desk was abandoned. No pale figures, no nurse in uniform, just the antiseptic glow of fluorescent lights humming softly, as though nothing had happened at all. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined everything. If fear and exhaustion had painted nightmares onto the sterile canvas of the hospital, he almost wanted to believe it. Then the automatic doors began to close behind him, and just as the glass panels slid together, he heard it clear, cold, and impossibly close. "Are you waiting for someone?" The voice came from the other side of the doors, sharp enough to pierce his bones. Arun stumbled backward into the night, his heart hammering, the incense nearly slipping from his grasp. He didn't dare look again. He ran until the hospital was no longer in sight, his breath ragged, the question still echoing in his ears. And even now, he wonders, if he had stayed a moment longer, if he had answered, if, in some way, he already had, because some waits never end, and some waiting rooms never let you leave the same. Hospitals are meant to be places of healing, but across Asia they often hold something far darker. The story of Phranangklao showed how even a modern ward can become a threshold where the living and the dead share the same space. But it isn't the only one. Travel a little further, and you'll find another hospital with an even heavier shadow, one whose history is soaked in war, suffering, and whispers that have never faded. Old Changi Hospital in Singapore. Unlike Phranangklao, this one no longer admits patients. Its halls are silent, its doors chained. Yet those who enter say silence doesn't mean safety, because sometimes the past doesn't die, it lingers. And those who wait inside learn quickly that in Old Changi, you are never truly waiting alone. One story done, and one to go. I hope you like the stories so far. When I make these long videos, there are nights where I stay up really late working on them. Tomorrow, I will be uploading another video. If you don't want to miss it, just subscribe. It's free. Haha. Perched high on a hill overlooking the Singapore Strait, Old Changi Hospital has always loomed like a scar against the skyline. Its skeletal structure still rises above the trees, its windows shattered, its paint peeled to a sickly gray. For most people, it is nothing more than a relic of another time, a forgotten ruin fenced off to keep the curious away. But for some, the place is a test of courage, a dare whispered among friends when the night grows long. That was how Jian found himself there. Jian wasn't a thrill-seeker by nature. He didn't chase ghost stories or hunt for haunted places. But he had grown up hearing tales of Old Changi, whispered by his grandparents' stories of soldiers who never left, of patients who screamed through the night, of shadows pacing the stairwells. When his friends suggested sneaking in after dark, Jian had laughed it off at first. Yet something inside him burned with curiosity. Maybe it was the challenge. Maybe it was the way everyone else seemed afraid. Or maybe it was because he wanted to prove, most of all to himself, that he wasn't ruled by fear. So there he was, standing at the rusted gates of Old Changi as midnight drew near. His friends had backed out at the last moment, inventing excuses about early mornings and strict parents. Jian told them he didn't mind. He would go in alone. After all, what was there really to fear? The hospital had been abandoned for decades. Its ghosts, if they existed, were only stories carried on the breath of the wind. The air was damp with the smell of salt water drifting in from the sea. The sound of waves crashing faintly against the shore below carried through the night. But here at the hospital gates, the air felt unnaturally still. Even the cicadas, so loud in the trees on his walk up the hill, had gone silent. Jian pushed the gate open just enough to slip through. The metal groaned, the sound jarring in the quiet. His flashlight beam cut across the overgrown courtyard, sweeping over weeds, pushing through cracked pavement and the blackened shell of what once had been a guard post. The building itself loomed ahead, its windows like dark sockets staring out at him. Inside, the air was cooler, heavy with the scent of mold and rust. His footsteps echoed sharply against the tiled floors, bouncing down empty corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The beam of his flashlight caught remnants of its past, rusted bed frames shoved against walls, dangling wires where lights had once hung, faded signs pointing toward wards that no longer existed. He paused at the foot of a staircase. The stories he had heard returned in whispers. The woman in white, forever pacing those very stairs. The guards who had quit after hearing laughter echoing from the closed pediatric ward above. Jian steadied his breath, telling himself these were just tales, nothing more. Still, he avoided the stairs for now, choosing instead to follow the hallway deeper inside. The further he walked, the heavier the atmosphere became. The silence was thick, broken only by the crunch of plaster beneath his shoes and the distant drip of water, echoing from somewhere unseen. His light fell on graffiti scrawled across the walls, names, dates, crude warnings left by others who had come before him. Yet one message, written in red spray paint across a door, made him pause. "Do not wait alone." The words stared back at him, jagged and uneven. Jian swallowed hard, gripping his flashlight tighter. He didn't want to admit it, But something about the message unsettled him more than the broken furniture or the rotting smell. It was as if the walls themselves were warning him. Still, he pressed on, because Jian had come here for a reason. Not just to see the hospital, not just to prove himself, but to answer the question that had haunted him since childhood. Were the stories true? Was Old Changi really a place where the past lingered, where the living were never alone? And as he stepped further into the darkness, the hospital seemed eager to answer. Jian's footsteps echoed softly down the corridor, each one bouncing back at him as though the building itself were mocking his presence. His flashlight beam swayed across the walls, catching fragments of Old Changi's history, a cracked clock frozen at 3:15, a rusting 4 stand abandoned in a corner, papers scattered, like brittle leaves across the floor. The deeper he went, the more he felt the weight of the hospital pressing down on him, heavy and suffocating, like a blanket of stale air that hadn't been disturbed in decades. At first, it was just the feeling, that quiet pressure in the chest, the sense of being watched even when alone. Jian had expected some of that. It was what came with creeping through a place that carried so many stories. But then the silence broke. He heard it clearly, a faint metallic clink. Jian stopped in his tracks, swinging his light toward the sound. The corridor stretched ahead, empty and still. He held his breath, waiting, but nothing moved. Just the steady drip of water, somewhere far off. Then it came again. Clink, scrape. It was the unmistakable sound of chains being dragged across tile. The hairs on the back of Jian's neck stood up. He had heard his grandmother talk about this, how, during the war, Old Changi had been more than a hospital. The Japanese had turned its wards into interrogation chambers, its walls soaked with screams. Locals said the chains had never been lifted, that at night you could still hear them dragging through the halls, even though no one alive carried them anymore. Jian's mouth went dry. He told himself it was probably metal falling somewhere, or a loose pipe shifting, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone was walking slowly, step by step, chains trailing behind them. He stepped backward, his light trembling as he held it toward the corridor. Nothing appeared, but the noise carried, scraping closer before fading suddenly into silence. Jian's pulse thundered in his ears. He wanted to leave, but curiosity held him in place. He pressed forward cautiously, scanning the floor. His beam caught gouges in the tile, fresh marks, as if something heavy had been dragged across it not long ago. That was when he noticed the temperature. The air had grown colder, prickling his skin, a stark contrast to the humid night outside. Each breath left a faint cloud in front of him. And then he saw it, a bed. It sat at the end of the hallway, half buried in shadow, its frame rusted, its sheets torn. Jian was sure it hadn't been there earlier. He swept his light across it, his chest tightening. The sheets moved, just slightly, as though something underneath had shifted. He froze, every muscle locked. The bed stilled again, perfectly still, yet the impression of weight remained, something invisible pressing down, holding the sheets in place. Jian's throat tightened, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple despite the cold. He turned to leave, but before he could take a step, a new sound rose, laughter. It was faint, distant, and high-pitched, the unmistakable sound of children. It drifted down the corridor from behind him, carried on the stale air. Jian spun around, his beam cutting through the dark. The hallway stretched back the way he'd come, empty and silent. Yet the laughter lingered, bubbling softly, like children playing a game just out of sight. Jian's chest heaved, the pediatric ward. He knew the stories. How guards had quit after hearing voices there. how visitors swore they saw shadows darting between the broken cribs. The wing had been closed for decades, but the children, it seemed, had never left. The laughter stopped as abruptly as it had begun, and then came the whisper, right behind him. Jian spun, his flashlight jerking wildly, but there was nothing there. Just the bed, the sheets now perfectly still, and the cold pressing tighter around him. His breath came ragged, shallow. He wanted to tell himself it was his imagination, that he was primed by stories and shadows. But deep inside, he knew this was the first crack in Old Changi's silence. Something had noticed him. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to move, to put one foot in front of the other. He whispered under his breath, half to himself, half as a plea to whatever listened. "I'm just looking. I'm not staying." But as he turned down another corridor, the silence thickened again. The shadows stretched longer. And Jian realized the hospital wasn't simply holding its history, it was testing him, watching his every move. He was no longer exploring Old Changi. He had stepped into its memory, and now he was part of it. Jian's steps quickened as he moved deeper into the hospital, though every instinct screamed at him to turn back. The corridors seemed endless, each one branching into another, as though the building had rearranged itself the moment he entered. His flashlight beam jittered across peeling walls, broken stretchers, and graffiti scrawled like frantic warnings. The silence pressed in harder with each step until he felt smothered by it. Then came the second sound, a shuffle, not footsteps exactly, but the dragging of something soft along the floor. Jian froze, sweeping the light toward the noise. The beam landed on a staircase. There, halfway up the steps, stood a figure, a woman. Her head was bowed, her hair falling over her face, her dress a pale blur in the dimness. She didn't move, didn't breathe, but Jian felt her watching him. His mouth went dry. He remembered the stories, the woman in white, forever pacing the stairwells. Guards had seen her. Visitors had fled from her. And now she was here, blocking his way. Jian stumbled back, his flashlight trembling. For a moment the beam slipped, and when it returned to the staircase, she was gone. Only empty steps remained. The air turned colder. He tried to convince himself he had imagined it, but his body knew better. His pulse thudded in his ears as he stumbled down another corridor, desperate to put distance between himself and the stairs. That was when he saw the writing again. This time, it wasn't graffiti. On the wall ahead, scratched deep into the plaster, were the words, "Don't look behind you." Jian froze, his breath catching in his throat. The words were jagged, uneven, as though carved in desperation. His body stiffened. He hadn't heard anything behind him, but the weight of presence pressed heavily against his back, as though something stood there, waiting. He didn't dare turn. He kept his eyes fixed on the message, forcing his trembling legs to keep moving forward. His hand gripped the flashlight so tightly it hurt. The corridor opened into a wider space, what looked like an old waiting area. Chairs were scattered and overturned, windows shattered to let in the salty breeze from the sea. Jian let out a shaky breath, relieved to see a place less confined, but relief lasted only seconds. One of the chairs moved. It scraped across the floor, a sharp, grating sound that made Jian's skin crawl. He swung his light toward it, heart pounding. The chair settled back into place as though it had never moved. Yet the sound echoed in his skull. Then another chair shifted, this time to his left. Then another, directly behind him. The waiting area filled with the noise of scraping metal, chairs dragging slowly across the tiles, encircling him. Jian spun in circles, his beam catching only glimpses of movement before it vanished. The chairs were closing in, forming a jagged ring around him. His chest heaved, panic clawing at his throat. He wanted to scream, but his voice caught. And then, from the far side of the room, a voice broke the chaos. "You shouldn't be here." It was a man's voice, weak, raspy, but human. Jian's eyes darted to the corner, where an old man sat slumped against the wall. His clothes were ragged, his skin gray with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with urgency. Jian stepped closer, relief flooding through him at the sight of another person. "Please," he stammered. "How do I get out?" The old man shook his head, his expression grim. "They've seen you now. Don't wait, don't stop. And whatever you do," his voice cracked, barely audible, "never answer them." John's stomach dropped. Answer who? But before the man could respond, a cold gust swept through the room. Jian blinked against it, and when he looked again, the corner was empty. The man was gone. The chairs stood still once more, perfectly arranged, as though they had never moved at all. Jian's hands trembled violently. He realized he hadn't just stumbled into Old Changi's ruins. He had walked into its rules. Rules he didn't understand. Rules that everyone else who had come before him must have broken. And now the hospital was waiting to see if he would break them too. Jian's heart raced as he stumbled out of the waiting area, desperate to put distance between himself and the vanishing old man. The words clung to him like a curse. Never answer them. His breath came in sharp bursts, echoing off the walls as if the building itself was mocking his panic. Every hallway looked the same, every doorway yawning like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. The air grew colder with each step, heavy with a weight that pressed against his chest. Jian lifted his flashlight, but the beam faltered, flickering as though the batteries were draining all at once. In the moments of darkness between flickers, he caught glimpses of movement, shadows darting across the walls, shapes crouched in corners. He blinked, and they were gone. But the feeling of being surrounded deepened. Then he heard it again. Footsteps, soft at first, measured, deliberate. They came from behind him, steady as a heartbeat. Jian froze, the warning carved into the wall clawing at his mind. "Don't look behind you." His throat tightened, his instincts screaming to turn and face whatever was there. But his legs locked in place, trembling, unable to decide whether to flee or confront. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just a few feet away. John's skin prickled, his breath shallow. Silence swallowed the hall. And then came the voice. "Are you waiting for someone?" Flat, cold, the same voice the old man had warned him about. Jian's stomach dropped, bile rising in his throat. He clenched his jaw, every fiber of his being screaming not to answer. But the silence stretched unbearably, the weight of the question pressing on him like a hand on the back of his neck. His knees buckled, and he staggered forward, forcing his body into motion. He didn't look back. He couldn't. His footsteps thundered against the tiles as he bolted down the hall. The air around him seemed to ripple, thick and distorted, as though he were running under water. His flashlight flickered violently, the beam catching flashes of pale faces in the corners of his vision. Some looked like soldiers in ragged uniforms. Others were children, their hollow eyes fixed on him as they stood in doorways. Each glimpse was gone as quickly as it appeared, but he felt them closing in. He stumbled into another stairwell, gasping for breath. The staircase spiraled upward into darkness. The steps cracked and stained. Against his better judgment, Jian began to climb, his shoes scraping against the stone. Halfway up, the air grew icy again, and he knew he wasn't alone. On the landing above, a figure waited, the woman in white. Her hair hung in a curtain over her face, her dress torn and pale. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though she had been waiting just for him. Jian's chest heaved, his breath fogging in the freezing air. She stepped forward. Her movements were deliberate, each one scraping against his nerves like nails on glass. The stairwell filled with the stench of decay, thick and suffocating. Jian stumbled backward, his flashlight beam shaking wildly. The woman's head lifted slightly, just enough for him to see beneath her hair. Her eyes were empty sockets, dark hollows that seemed to drink in the light. Her mouth opened slowly, impossibly wide, until it stretched into a gaping void. And from that void came the same question. "Are you waiting for someone?" The sound was wrong, echoing from everywhere at once, bouncing off the walls, reverberating inside Jian's skull. He clapped his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The voice wasn't just sound anymore. It was inside him, clawing at his thoughts, demanding an answer. His vision blurred, the stairwell spinning around him. Shadows crawled across the walls, forming shapes that reached for him with skeletal hands. He staggered against the railing, his knuckles white as he clung to it for balance. The question repeated, louder this time. "Are you waiting for someone?" The woman in white moved closer, her hollow eyes fixed on him. Her mouth kept moving, though the words no longer matched the sound. The question spilled from everywhere, overlapping, multiplying, until it was a chorus of voices, the soldiers, the children, the patients, all asking the same thing in unison. Jian's knees buckled. He dropped to the steps, clutching his head, his mind fracturing under the relentless question. His flashlight rolled away, clattering down the stairs, plunging him into near darkness. In that moment, Jian understood this wasn't just a haunting. This was a trap. Old Changi was not a place where spirits lingered aimlessly. It was a place that asked, that tested, that waited. And now, it was his turn to answer. Jian crouched on the steps, his body trembling as the voices pressed harder into his skull. The question repeated again and again, each echo louder than the last, as though the entire hospital demanded his response. He clutched his ears, but the sound came from within, not outside. His vision swam, the stairwell dissolving into overlapping flashes of faces, children giggling, soldiers standing silent, patients with hollow eyes fixed forward. They surrounded him, but none of them moved. They were waiting. And then, as suddenly as it began, the voices cut off. Silence crashed down, so heavy it made Jian's ears ring. He opened his eyes slowly, gasping for air. The stairwell was empty. No woman in white. No shifting shadows. Only the faint beam of his flashlight, resting at the base of the stairs. He forced himself to stand, legs shaking. The silence felt wrong, unnatural, but it gave him just enough clarity to stumble downward and retrieve the light. As he picked it up, the air stirred. Someone was standing at the bottom of the stairs. It wasn't the woman this time. It was the old man again, the same one Jian had seen in the waiting area. His figure looked thinner now, more fragile, but his eyes were sharp, burning with urgency. "You heard them, didn't you?" the man rasped. Jian's throat tightened. He could only nod. The man's expression darkened. "They always ask. That's how they pull you in." Jian's voice cracked when he finally spoke. "Who are they?" The old man shook his head slowly. "Not who, what? Pieces of this place. They're what's left of everyone who suffered here. Prisoners, patients, children, they all wait, caught in the same question." Jian's breath caught. The laughter in the halls, the dragging chains, the pale figures in the waiting area. It wasn't just scattered hauntings. They were fragments of something larger, bound by the same cycle. The old man stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. It doesn't matter what you saw. What matters is how you answer. Jian swallowed hard, the memory of the cold voice rattling in his mind. And if I don't, the man's gaze sharpened, then they choose for you, and once they choose, you don't leave. The words landed like a stone in Jian's stomach. He remembered the warning carved into the wall, the shifting chairs, the faces staring from the shadows. None of it had been random. The hospital wasn't simply haunted. It was hunting. Testing. Jian's mind reeled. "Why me?" he whispered. The old man gave a humorless laugh, dry and brittle. "Why, anyone? Because you came here. Because you waited. That's all it takes." A chill ran through Jian's spine. He had lingered in the corridors, stood frozen on the stairs, crouched in silence as the voices demanded an answer. Every moment he had hesitated, every second he remained, had been part of the game. The man's face softened slightly, though his eyes still carried that desperate intensity. "Listen to me. If they ask again, don't speak. Don't even think of the words. They feed on your answer. Twist it until it binds you here. The only reason you're still breathing is because you haven't given them what they want." Jian's pulse quickened. The rules were clearer now, but the danger felt sharper. He realized why the graffiti had warned him not to look back, why the chairs had scraped closer, why the woman in white had stood waiting on the stairs. Every piece was designed to trap him, to push him toward the question. The old man stepped back into the shadows. "You must leave before they come again. Do not wait. Not here." Jian wanted to reach for him, to ask more, but the man was already fading, his outline dissolved like mist, his voice growing fainter. "Remember, never answer." And then he was gone. The stairwell fell silent again, but Jian no longer felt alone. The truth gnawed at him, reframing everything he had experienced. The chains, the laughter, the woman, even the whispers, they weren't isolated hauntings. They were the hospital itself, alive in its suffering, testing anyone foolish enough to step inside. Jian gripped the flashlight tighter, forcing himself to breathe. His path was clear now. He had to get out before the question returned. Because if it did, he knew he might not have the strength to resist. And deep down, another truth chilled him even more. The old man had spoken with such urgency, with such certainty, but Jian couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just warning him. He had been someone who failed. Someone who once sat in silence, waiting until the hospital chose for him. Jian staggered through the corridors, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly against the walls. The old man's words rang in his ears with every step. Never answer. Never wait. His chest burned as though the air itself had turned against him, pressing tighter the closer he got to the exit. The hospital no longer felt empty. Shadows slipped between doorways just out of sight, watching, waiting. He could hear faint whispers rising from the rooms, soft and insistent, weaving together like a chorus calling his name. He refused to listen. He kept his eyes forward, his body moving, even when it begged to collapse. At last, he saw at the shattered front doors, the moonlight spilling in through broken glass. Relief surged through him. He forced his legs to move faster, the sound of his shoes slapping against the tile echoing like gunfire. He was so close. Then the footsteps returned. Click, click. They followed him, steady and unhurried, keeping perfect pace no matter how fast he ran. His skin crawled, his throat closing in panic. He didn't dare turn, but the sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be just behind his ear. "Are you waiting for someone?" The voice was clear, cold, and impossibly close. Jian nearly tripped as he lunged forward, bursting through the doorway into the humid night air. He ran down the hill without looking back, his lungs screaming, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might tear from his chest. Only when he reached the road at the bottom did he stop, collapsing to his knees, gasping for air. The night was still, no footsteps, no voices, just the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. For a moment, he let himself believe he was safe. Then, in the silence, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Hands trembling, he pulled it out. The screen lit up, displaying a single message from an unknown number. It read, "We are still waiting." I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story about. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.